Okay, Elas Vlog. Okay, reaction video tayo mga kaibigan at update dito sa nangyayaring gera sa Ukraine. Na ito na nga, Ukrainian shock Russia Third Army launch a major mutiny against Kremlin, Putin in trouble. Ito na mga kaibigan, nagtitrending ngayon.
Welcome to the Frontline Reports YouTube channel. Every day, Russia faces a new challenge as the war continues. The day before yesterday, Russian volunteers fighting for Ukraine said they had launched a cross-border offensive in the Russian regions of Belgorod and Kursk and were engaged in active fighting. This news sent shockwaves through Russia. Fighters from the Freedom for Russia Legion, the Russian Volunteer Corps, and volunteers from the Siberian Battalion are taking part in this operation. The Freedom for Russia Legion announces its actions on social media. The Legion claimed to have destroyed a Russian armored military vehicle in the village of Tyotkino in the Kursk region. Another group, the Siberian Battalion, made the following statement on social media. As promised, we are bringing freedom and justice to our Russian lands. A representative of the Freedom for Russia Legion confirmed that fighting is currently taking place on Russian territory. The Legion issued the following statement. We are here to liberate you from poverty and fear, to liberate you from the dictatorship imposed by a terrorist organization that has seized power. The fighters pledged to reclaim their land centimeter by centimeter from the Russian regime. Meanwhile, Russian volunteers from the Siberian Battalion entered Russian territory. They released a video showing a group of fighters advancing through the forest. The fighters of the battalion made the following statement. We have always maintained that the murderous dictatorial regime in the Russian Federation cannot be overthrown peacefully. We have always maintained that this regime can only be removed through armed resistance. Tonight we begin to fulfill that promise. The Legion shared footage of the infiltration on the Russian border. The video shows Russian volunteers entering Russian territory in the dark of night with heavy equipment. These attacks have horrified the Russian authorities. A recent attack from Ukraine by Russian opposition groups opposed to the Kremlin has prompted emergency evacuation calls in key regions of Russia. The rebel group issued a call on a messaging platform. The group urged residents of the Kursk and Belgorod regions to evacuate immediately due to the ongoing shelling in Ukraine and rising tensions along the border. The Russian Volunteer Union issued the following statement. We once again appeal to the residents of the Kursk and Belgorod regions. Your leadership has not taken any measures to protect or evacuate you, and the shelling of peaceful cities and villages in Ukraine continues. We are forced to respond to military targets, border areas, evacuate immediately. The Russian Legion of Freedom, the Russian Volunteer Corps, and the Siberian Battalion have a common goal. To liberate Russia from what they describe as Putin's dictatorship. Later in the day, Ukraine fired at least 8 missiles at Russia's Belgorod border region. The Ukrainian missiles liquidated 2 people and wounded 12 others. Ukrainian forces also conducted cross-border raids in the Belgorod and Kursk regions, according to local officials. In this operation, Ukrainian fighters destroyed 5 enemy tanks and 4 armored infantry vehicles. The long-range drone strikes and the Ukrainian offensive come at a time when Russian President Vladimir Putin is almost certainly up for re-election. Putin has sought to persuade Russians to keep him...
Si Putin, win agad, win again, mga kaibigan. Okay? Panalo na naman.
...in power as the war in Ukraine enters its 3rd year, and amid what he says are external threats to the country. Putin urged Russians to go to the polls and characterized participation in the elections as a manifestation of patriotism. Putin assured Russians that the only source of power in the country was the people. Putin then stated the following. You must not only cast your vote, but also firmly declare your will and desires, your personal participation in the further development of Russia. Elections are a step into the future. Since coming to power almost 25 years ago, Putin has eliminated all independent media and dissenting voices in Russia. Putin's repressive regime has intensified, especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Analysts believe the Kremlin is worried about low turnout during the 3-day vote. Sam Green of the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington called Russia's election a fraud. He said, the Kremlin controls who is on the ballot.
Fraud, ibig sabihin, dinaya. Alright? Kasi win na naman si Putin.
The Kremlin controls how they can campaign, not to mention being able to control every aspect of the voting and the vote counting process. Russia's opposition in exile is calling on Russians to protest the election by gathering at polling stations at midday this weekend to signal that they do not support Putin. The event, called Noon Against Putin, is being promoted by Yulia Navalnaya, the wife of Russia's most prominent opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who died last month in a remote penal colony in the Arctic. Meanwhile, the Chinese government's special representative for Eurasian affairs will lead a delegation of Chinese observers to the Russian presidential election. Li Hui's participation in the election process follows his extensive diplomatic efforts to resolve the ongoing Ukrainian conflict. Li Hui's recent trip included visits to Russia, the EU, Poland, Ukraine, Germany, and France. The move underscores the growing alliance between Russia and China and adds a new layer of scrutiny to an already contentious election.
So mga kaibigan, mag-best friend ito. China and Russia mag-best friend.
Russia's decision not to invite observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has drawn criticism. Matteo Micacci, director of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Department for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, expressed disappointment that the lack of international observers undermined the credibility of the electoral process. This marks the second consecutive presidential election in Russia held without observation by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This raises further concerns about transparency and democratic norms. Micacci stated the following: "We are very disappointed with the decision not to invite the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to observe the Russian presidential elections. This is contrary to the Russian Federation's commitments to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and would also deny the impartiality of the country's electorate and institutions." Vladimir Putin appears ready to run for another term despite the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and increasing isolation on the global stage. Putin's tight grip on power, established over 24 years in office, has stifled dissent through legislative measures and the suppression of opposition voices. Critics have faced imprisonment, exile, and even death. This has contributed to an atmosphere of fear and censorship. In the run-up to the elections, Putin intensified his crackdown on the opposition, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. Protests were met with swift and violent repression, and a new law was passed criminalizing public criticism of the war. The Kremlin's narrative portrays opposition activists and war critics as Western puppets and reinforces Putin's image as a strong leader defending Russian interests. The expected outcome of the election is likely to embolden Putin, validate his policies, and strengthen his position on the global stage. Observers believe that his victory could lead to an escalation of the conflict in Ukraine and a more aggressive foreign policy stance. Putin's re-election is also expected to strengthen alliances with China, India, and other countries and further consolidate his control over Russian politics. Later in the day, French President Emmanuel Macron made some remarks on the war in Ukraine. The war on Ukrainian territory is of vital importance for Europe and for France. Therefore, the option of sending French troops to Ukraine, if necessary in the future, has not been ruled out. The events of recent years have shown that sometimes what we thought was impossible has come true. Strasbourg and Lviv are less than 1,500 kilometers apart. Do you understand? Only 1,500. The war is already here, very close. In addition, French President Emmanuel Macron said Crimea must once again be recognized as part of Ukraine to ensure lasting peace in the region. The French leader made international headlines last month after he said he could not rule out the eventual deployment of Western troops to Ukraine. Macron backtracked slightly from this position a few days later. However, Macron has since said that the issue of Western boots on the ground should not be banned. Russia was quick to condemn Macron's original statement that Western troops were directly involved in the war. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that such a move would result in the inevitability of a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. Macron made a statement like this: "We are doing everything we can to help Ukraine defeat Russia. Because without sovereignty, without a return to Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, including Crimea, there can be no lasting peace. Given the importance Russian President Vladimir Putin attaches to the peninsula, his comments on Crimea are likely to be downplayed by the Kremlin. Putin invaded Crimea in 2014 and annexed it from Ukraine in 2014. The peninsula has been a major topic of discussion since February 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said many times that one of his goals in the conflict is to take back Crimea and 4 other regions that Putin annexed in September 2022. Putin has maintained that Crimea belongs to Russia, while Kremlin officials have repeatedly said that returning the region to Ukraine would not be included in any possible peace negotiations. Macron emphasized that if Russia wins the war, Europe's credibility will be reduced to zero. Macron continued by emphasizing that France sees Russia as an enemy because of its support for Kiev. Macron continued his remarks as follows: "Today, Russia is definitely an enemy. The Kremlin regime is an enemy. As I have always said, we are not waging a war against Russia and the Russian people. We are supporting Ukraine. Crimea is not just symbolic. Crimea is also strategically important because the peninsula serves as a central logistics hub for Russia's military forces in southern Ukraine. The past year has seen an increase in the frequency of Ukrainian attacks in Crimea. One of the most notable attacks on Putin's navy in the region took place on March 5th, when a squadron of Ukrainian Magura V-5 naval drones destroyed the $65 million Sergei Kotov patrol ship." Thank you for tuning in.
Alright, okay, yun na nga mga kaibigan, na ito na yung update sa Ukraine versus Russia. Russia and versus Ukraine. Even Ukrainian shock, okay? Ibig sabihin ay Russia, Third Army launch a major mutiny against Kremlin. Kasi nga itong Russia, paubos ng sundalo nito eh. Si Putin ayaw tumigil eh. Ayaw tumigil. Oh, hanggat di nasasakop ang Ukraine. Bahala na sila. Okay? Basta reaction video lang ito mga kaibigan ha. Kasi nga dati yung channel ko talagang puro gira about sa Ukraine war ang aking ngayon. Hindi na ako masyadong nagsasalita kasi nga alam na, okay? Nakakaawa mga sibilyan. Okay, hanggang dito na lang mga kaibigan. Masasabi nyo, subscribe and thank you very much. Bye bye.